Hi, it's Russ Bowles from RKB Horticulture Consultants, in to do some early spring pruning. Spring is finally on its way and we're itching to get started. Two main tools we use are loppers, shears, and hand pruners, better known as secateurs. We've got a fairly common spirea bush here. Blooms in the summer, lovely pink flowers. Some of them are variegated, some with golden foliage. But to keep them in shape and in bounds, you want to annually take back some of the oldest growth, like most flowering shrubs, and always encourage new flowering wood. Two things when they're pruning: they're very tentative and afraid of taking too much off. Most deciduous shrubs you could cut right to the ground and they'd spring up and start all over again, so you don't have to worry about them being cut too hard. The other thing is, instead of doing a lot of little cuts all around the outside and giving a brush cut effect, you want to thin it out, keep a nice natural shape, and ideally it really shouldn't look like it's pruned when you're finished. So before, what you've got here are the old flower clusters. Just for aesthetics, we'll take them off. But you can very often tell from the color of the wood, the older, grayer wood is the oldest. So rather than me taking in a shoot like this, every one of these shoots back so many inches, I'll go down next to where there's a side shoot coming off and take that whole cluster out, rather than having made 6 cuts across the board. And I'll do that initially on most of the older wood, always cutting back to where there's a side shoot coming out. If you leave a stub, it's just going to die back and lead to decay or insects infecting the plant or whatever. You just work your way around the plant. In this case, you don't want it growing into the pine behind us, so we'll take this one back fairly low to a side shoot, and then the remaining new growth, I'll take at least a half off. The ultimate being to reduce this whole shrub by about half. So again, going in, cutting off to a side shoot. Again, that's what you're taking off, rather than taking each one of these and leaving this brush cut effect. Also, any winter damage, if it's been broken or cracked, you can take them right out. Anything that's died, obviously, you're going to take right out as well. In this case, to thin this center out, I'm going to take quite a good cluster out there. Early spring, as soon as it's warm enough for the gardener, it's warm enough for start pruning. It's easier to see before they're out in leaf where to make your cuts. It also is less likely to do damage if the shoots are budding out too far, where you're knocking them off as you're pruning. That's particularly important when you're doing fruit trees and fruiting bodies. If you leave it too late, you're knocking off a lot of the new growth. This can be done, as I mentioned, usually every year, depending on the rate of growth on the plant and the ultimate size that you want your plant. Obviously, you don't want to take out a huge amount because you want as much flower as possible. Get better air movement within the plant. It's nice to thin it out somewhat. The timing, as I mentioned, early spring is great. Depending what you're pruning, if it's a spring flowering, early spring flowering like forsythia, it is better to wait till after it's finished flowering, otherwise you're cutting a lot off this spring's bloom. So in a case of forsythia, cut out a lot of the old flowering branches immediately after it's finished blooming. And as most of you know, with forsythia, they'll explode and put sometimes 5 or 6 feet of new growth anyway.